Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Okay, good afternoon. I see everybody's observing social distancing down in the... Everyone's crammed to the front, but I think that's an index of excitement for our speaker and what we're doing today, and what she will be speaking about today. So my name is James Glisson, and good afternoon, and welcome to the Santa Barbara Museum of Art. I am the curator of contemporary art, and I have the great pleasure of welcoming the renowned artist Alison Saar to the museum to give a lecture, which is of Iron and Sinew.
Yes.
I got it. Okay, wonderful title. The Alchemy of Metal and the Magic of Casting. This lecture is part of the programming for the exhibition Fire, Metal, Monument, Bronze, which is currently upstairs in the von Romberg and Emmons Gallery. The exhibition traces the history of bronze and metal casting from the 12th century BCE up to 2009, which is to say from the ancient Shang dynasty in China up to Alison Saar with her bronze cast Inheritance, which is on view. The exhibition draws on 3,000 years and includes works from ancient China, ancient Persia, Tibet, France, and Southern California. And with one exception, it's drawn exclusively from artworks in the museum's collection. And it closes on January 9th. Throughout her distinguished and productive career, Alison has worked with metals, often as part of found objects that go into her evocative assemblages. She has hammered, cast, cut, and shaped them. Her work in metals has deep connections with the vibrant traditions and contemporary practices of metalwork in West Africa. The magic of metals and the mysteries of their chemistry and the mythologies of the forge and the powers of the metal worker or metallurgist who can harness and subdue the strength and durability of metals, all of these are long-standing and well-established themes in her work and powerfully inform her art. A brief introduction, and so I couldn't think of a better person to invite to talk about the themes of the Bronze Show, but bring into focus the very important metalworking traditions in Africa that are not represented in the exhibition. So it's a way to make up for, to some degree, a deficit in what's on display. Now, a brief introduction can't do justice to all of her career, so I have to kind of take some highlights. But to just give you a sense, right now, today, she has a major retrospective on view in 2 spaces in Los Angeles. It is called Alison Saar of Aether and Earthe, and it can be seen at the Pasadena Armory in Pasadena and the Benton Museum at Pomona College. If that isn't enough, Alison also curated an exhibition currently on view at LA Louvre Gallery in Venice. There's a catalog, which I went to the trouble of bringing. Would someone hold it up since I forgot to bring it up? And a very beautifully produced and very intelligent catalog of Aether and Earthe that I forgot to bring up there with me that is currently for sale as part of the show. These exhibitions have been glowingly reviewed in the New York Times, LA Times, Financial Times, KCET, and they're both on view in LA for another month. I've seen them. Get down to LA. You don't want to miss them. They're very important. Very good survey of where she's been and where she is now. Also, make sure to read Jory Finkel's recent feature article on Alison in the New York Times. Titled Transforming Outrage into Art, the article explores Alison's commitment to art, politics, and racial justice. Now, she's been a little more, I have to say a little bit more. She's been in at least 40 one-person shows, and her work is in the collections of over 60 museums, including the Santa Barbara Museum of Art, woohoo, National Museum of American Art, National Museum of African American History and Culture, the National Gallery of Australia, the Museum of Modern Art, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and many others. She's won awards from the Joan Mitchell Foundation, Scripps College, where she earned her BA, From Otis College, where she earned an MFA, the National Endowment for Arts a number of times, and the Guggenheim Foundation, among many others. Finally, she comes from a very distinguished family of artists, each of whom has made their own mark on the art world and art history. And I'm really happy to welcome her family members who are in the audience today, Betty, Tracy, and Spencer. So thank you for joining us. And welcome, Alison. Thank you so much. We're so glad to have you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I realized I didn't turn my phone off, so let me do that before it embarrasses me. Sorry. Okay. So yes, iron and sinew. It was interesting that you mentioned the Ironwork of Africa. I think maybe a couple of the two major influences in my career was my mother's exposure of the art of Africa to myself and other cultures, non-Western cultures, and then my father's exposing me to, Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci, more traditional Western, and he had this really wonderful book on Greek bronzes, which I think really informs a lot of this sort of open eye look, and I think I didn't have much time to spend with the exhibit up there, but that's kind of a real classic sort of thing as well. So I'm going to start with this piece called Smokin' Papa Shode, and a shodi is a pot in Haiti. He is Ogun, and he is the Fon god of fire and iron, and he is, you'll often in going through West Africa find their my mother's chatting it up. Find altars to him because you're using sharp tools made of iron and steel, and so I felt like this was someone that, since I use a chainsaw and chisels and all of that, this was someone that I needed to kind of pay tribute to. So he has all things iron kind of as offerings for him. He's got pots and pans and sickles and tools, and I think a foundry ladle in there as well, a lead ladle. And so the figure's 6 feet, and then he goes up like maybe another 4 feet, so he's like 10 feet tall in total. And then his partner is Yamaya, who's a Yoruba goddess of the seas and the oceans, the mother of many of the Orishas. And she's the opposite. While he is about fire and heat and forging and force, she's about water and cooling and the way water can change things. You think of like the way you look at Grand Canyon and see that great things, mountains can be moved with patience and endurance and care. And so she, for me, represents nurturing and creativity. I think she became really important to me when I was trying to juggle being a mother and an artist at the same time, which was challenging, and just like, yeah, cool down, just cool down, be patient, sort of thing. And she also has a stack of basins that would hold water, all these white basins. And it's in this tall kind of towering form is kind of reflective or in reference to a Haitian practice of putting a center post in the humfor. It's called a pitu metin, and it's this large pole that holds up the roof, but is also thought a space where spirits can slide down and come into our material world. And so it's like an intersection. It becomes this crossroad. Can I ask if it's okay if I take my mask off to speak? I'm sorry. Thank you. I will stand back because I realize it might be muffled, as well as I feel like I'm suffocating. So, and so this piece again is in reference. I think is kind of illustrates this sort of confluence between my mother's influence and my father's influence. Dying Slave, of course, is in reference to Michelangelo's Dying Slave. And then what he has but I wanted to do an African-American slave. And then what he has in his belly is an Nkongo fetish type thing. So it's all these nails that have been pounded into his belly. And Nkongo fetishes are really they're like spiritual judiciary systems that things are hammered in. You come to someone and for sort of consultation of, something something that's been wronged or something that's going wrong, and you'll kind of ask the deities to help intervene. And so here he's got a belly full of nails, and it's kind of like him seeking his sort of freedom. And I'm bad I didn't include a back version of this, but so he's carved out of wood. I should say a little quick technical notes here. They're carved out of wood, and then they are covered in ceiling tin. So that's, you see that, I think actually at Joe's, they had I noticed they had a pressed ceiling tin, decorative ceiling tin. And so that becomes this kind of protective skin. But on the back, what I did was I literally took a can opener and ripped up the tin on his back where he'd been lashed. And so you kind of see this raw wood underneath where his flesh has been exposed. And what I loved about the ceiling tin, first off, I loved that I was working at the Studio Museum in Harlem, and then later a residence there. And, when I'd walk to and from, I would see all of the stuff kind of pulled out. In the 80s, I was up there. And I love that this tin, some of it's Victorian, some of it's witnessed, was witnessed stuff from the turn of the century. And, in apartments in those days, people would be born in your apartment. You would have parties, you would have sex, you would, be cooking, and you would die in your apartments often. And I just love that this material basically witnessed, looked down, and was like this spiritual surveillance of everything that was happening within that space. And so it felt to me, and I think at the time I was 28 when I moved to New York, and I just felt like there was so much that I didn't know and so much that I really needed to learn. And this was a way to kind of absorb some of the juice of Harlem. And so I started cladding these pieces. And it was twofold. One was that it helped hold the pieces together because they're just basically glued pieces of wood underneath and kept, cracks were hidden and all that. But it also kind of gave them an armor, that they're somehow protected by this steel skin, and talks about the endurance of kind of trying to withstand the injustices on black bodies. And then it also becomes sort of a keloiding or a scarification, which is a practice that you can, often according to your scarification, you can tell, that person's tribe that the person comes from, their personal ancestors, who they're married to, how many children they have, so that really, as they go through life, they get these scars or these sort of cuts that then kind of tell, basically, they're diaristic. They tell who you are and where you belong and who your ancestors were. So I love that as well. And you think of our own scars. I mean, you can point out any scar on your body and that was when you were hopping the fence and got caught and all of this stuff, sort of thing. So I like that. It also relates to personal sort of ideas of scar. And this piece is called Scar Song. And so this one is different. And then this is copper repoussé. And if any of you out in the audience were in Girl Scouts or Boy Scouts, you may have done that, where you have a sheet of copper and you rub the back and it raises it up on the front. And so these were ones that I found. They're all collected from thrift stores and whatnot. We were just talking about estate sales. And so it's almost like the Illustrated Man, that she has all these different pictures kind of nailed all over herself, and it tells a story of different experiences, or perhaps future experiences. And then this piece is called Strange Fruit. Often my work comes out of music and songs, and of course Strange Fruit was a song made famous by Billie Holiday about lynchings. And this piece was really kind of looking at another aspect of that, and how it was a time in the 80s where women of color were being featured on the cover of magazines, and it seemed, we've really kind of turned a corner here, that these kind of very stringent ideas of blonde, blue-eyed beauty have kind of come around the bend. But then you kind of go deeper in and you see that, they're being posed in, tribal, like cheetah patterns or something, and they still had to somehow ethnicize it, and it still became this kind of, they were being presented as exotica in a weird sort of way. And so by strange fruit, I'm also talking about this idea of, coming upon a strange fruit and this desire to devour something that is something other than yourself. And so she is hanging by her feet, and it's kind of ambiguous as to whether she's kind of trying to hide her private parts or whether she's pleasuring herself. And it's just kind of really talking about how, Western, and I think, I hate to say it, but I think we're kind of experiencing a little bit of that now in the art world's current sort of appetite for Black artists. And that part of that is that this kind of, again, sort of colonialist attraction to something that is other. And that sounds very jaded, but I'm sorry. I've seen a couple of waves come and go. So I'm hoping that this will stick and that it is very genuine, but we will wait and see. But I think that is a big part of it. If you listen to the way some curators are talking about work. This piece is called Sledgehammer Mama, and it is currently in the Black Portraiture Show at Los Angeles County Museum of Art. She's rather small because that's an actual sledgehammer. And I became really interested. I should say that I did James had mentioned that I did my undergraduate work at Scripps College. And I had the pleasure of working with Dr. Samela Lewis, who exposed me not only to art of China, which that was her specialty, she was a Chinese art scholar, but also the art of Africa and the African diaspora and African art in the Americas. But I was really intrigued with the practice of having tools turn into figures, and that figures were handles of ceremonial tools, and that these tools represented not just a hammer, but these tools represented things that could be altered by that hammer or things that could be farmed, and it represented everything that tool made possible. And so this is a woman who's basically kind of, ready to punch you upside the face if you mess with her. And then this piece is called Skin Deep, and this was around the time, I guess it must have been in the early 90s or late 80s. I'm trying to think when, 89 maybe. I had just had my son, and I found it really difficult to watch the news because every time I turned on the news, it was open season on Black males. And I think we're experiencing that now. I don't know when we're going to not be experiencing that, but so this was this idea that it was, I forgot what the actual story was. I think it was a young man who had gone down to Florida and had been sort of abducted at the airport and dragged out and then doused with gasoline and set on fire. This is in the 80s. And it was also, I forget his first name, Mr. Bird, who was tied to the back of a pickup truck and dragged until he was decapitated. And it just seemed like I had to stop watching the news, for one. It was really disturbing, but also that it was open season on Black men. And so I took that sort of idea and made this really horrific piece. I remember talking to Thelma Golden, who was saying, "So what do you got going on?" I had been invited to be part of the famous '93 Whitney Biennial, and I should say infamous, but I said, I've got this piece, I don't know, I want to make it, but I think it's really a tough thing. And she said, what is it? So I described it, said, well, it's a Black man's body that's been skinned and flayed and nailed to the wall like a trophy. And she's like, oh, well, that's nothing. And it's true, I think Kiki Smith had someone on all fours with all of her entrails trailing out of her anus, and I don't know, there was a 6-foot wide pool of barf, and so, and it did become, oddly enough, it did become wallpaper, which is maybe even more disturbing to me, but I guess the Whitney liked it because they ended up keeping it. This piece is called Tree Souls. So these, again, are carved out of wood, but they're about 14 feet tall. So the figures themselves are 6 feet, and then we got like another, 8 or 9 feet of branches going up. But I was just really intrigued, I think, with sort of the spirits of nature in New York City. I lived next to Prospect Park, and walking through there, you realize that these trees, who've been, around 300 years, had witnessed, indigenous inhabitants, which were then overtaken by colonialists, and then, kind of just continues to move around. But at any rate, I just love this wisdom of these trees, so I made these figures. And some of you may recognize this piece, which is in the collection, Terra Firma. And I think that was also really kind of challenging for me. I grew up in Laurel Canyon, I still live now, and my mother lives there as well. So I was this kind of like little nature girl running around in the hills. And then when I moved to New York, it was the first time I'd lived in the city, and I lived like smack dab in the middle of the city. In the 80s, it was really complicated because many of the hospitals and facilities for people suffering from mental illness were shut down, and then they were basically turned out on the street. And that was kind of like the first wave of homelessness that I really witnessed firsthand, in terms of people sleeping, right outside your door and stuff like that. And I just became really, it just was really a painful experience to see how these folks were living, and continues to be as such, and how, many of them, had jobs and everything, but in New York, once you lose your job, then you lose your home, and then you're on your street, and it's too common a story today as it was then. And so Terra Firma was just to talk about how unfirma your terra can be. And on the way in, I met a couple of docents here, and they're saying, oh, the kids just really love that piece. And I remember when I first made it, it was at the, I think the first time I showed it was at the Hirshhorn Museum and Garden in Washington, D.C. And I brought my son to see it, and he just got on, laid down and took a nap with him. And all these kids want to lay down and just tuck in at them, like spoon with them sort of thing. So he has a gentleness to him, which I love. This piece is Tango. I think, a lot of my work deals with duality. I think being biracial, feeling like I'm this wild child growing up in Laurel Canyon that somehow has to kind of reel it in and be civilized and not so insane. And so I often feel like there's this kind of little battle going between my two selves. And so this is Tango. We're bound to each other by our hair, but we're kind of duking it out. And that's a small piece. They're maybe only 30 inches or 40 inches tall. And then this piece is called Suckle, and it really came from looking at the granary doors from Mali, where you may have seen them. They're these long, beautiful doors, and they have lots of breast on them, and they'll have other things as well. But I love this idea that breast were kind of, talking about females as nurturers and also kind of the guardians of all of the grain that was being stored, of everything that had been harvested. And so I decided to do a Black American version on skillets, and so it's just a wall of skillets, cast bronze, but they look like they're iron, with different sized breasts on them. And again, the title is Suckle. And then this is Mofro. This was my first attempt to use barbed wire as hair, which really was tough on my assistant at the time. I was doing a talk one day, and I said, I had this great assistant, and I scared her off, and then she said, excuse me, and she was in the audience, and she said, that's not why I left. I'm like, oh, well, okay. This idea that, her afro is just so intense. It's just kind of don't, you always hear this thing you don't want to be touching Black people's hair, and this one is it's really dangerous to touch this girl's hair. You're gonna get bit. And hair is a real running theme for me. I think maybe because I look like I'm white, and I feel like my hair is maybe the only thing that really kind of visually connects me to my Black ancestry. And so I'm really keen on sort of the history of hair, Black hair from Africa to the States, and how it's kind of come so many ways. And so this piece is called Blonde Dreams, and she's like a Rapunzel that, if only her hair were long and blonde, she could toss it out the window, and Prince Charming will climb up and save her from herself. And I should say that my father was an art conservator, and my sisters and I worked for him, and one of the things he taught us was traditional gold leaf. So this is a traditional gold leaf with red bowl underneath, and then burnished and all of that, which was kind of fun to do as an homage to my papa. And then this is the closest thing I've come to a self-portrait called Mirror, Mirror. And so the full title is Mirror, Mirror, Mulatta Seeking Inner Negress. And so she's holding up a skillet for a mirror, and then she can see in the skillet the reflection of her Black invisible self. And then this is Inheritance, and this piece is, the idea for this piece came about from my one and only trip to Africa, unfortunately, and I went to Senegal for a show, and was just kind of taken away by these young kids that were helping their mother bring stuff to the market, or 7-year-olds were carrying 2-year-olds on their backs or their shoulders, and just what these kids were doing, and how they were really participating in kind of keeping the family together and keeping things going. And I think about my own children who didn't want to take out the trash, or like fuss at silly things, and this how I thought of them as kind of like these really little heroes. And it's also in some ways an homage to my mother, who, when she was quite young, I think 5 maybe, Mommy, that her father suddenly became very ill and was on his deathbed, and said to her, you have to help take care of your mother and your siblings. And at the time she had a little brother and a little sister, and I think Bob was just an infant at the time. And I think in some ways it formed who she is, and that she's kind of like this overseeing mother. It's kind of really, I know she helped raise my other aunt as well, and how it just really, she's so dedicated to family, and I think we're so blessed to have her watching over us. But so that this piece is to all the child atlases out there in the world. And then, of course, this is our mini version that I had the pleasure of making with Dane at the Santa Barbara Community College, which was really fun. We had a ball wrapping party. We had a bunch of folks come over to their home. We all were wrapping them. It was kind of like a sewing bee sort of thing. It was really lovely. So this was cast bronze, cast here in Santa Barbara by the foundry at the community college, which is a really rare thing. I don't know if it still exists now, but it's really hard to, it's really a rich resource, so I hope they maintain that. This piece is called Compton Nocturne. And so I'm looking at, the kind of tradition, Western art traditions, and the odalisque, of course, is this sort of, voyeuristic portraits of women, lounging, often, I guess odalisque itself is that she's a servant girl or a concubine, and then the concubine has their own slaves. But this, I wanted to do one that was really kind of talking about, the here and now. And so this is, the title comes off of a riffing off of Harlem Nocturne by Duke Ellington. But since I'm from California, I had to switch it up with Compton. And so she's got these, kind of playing off of the Yoruba and Western Africa tradition of kind of using bottles to attract and trap spirits, and then that came across the Atlantic, and bottle trees were kind of the result of that. So these are all these bottles that are capturing all of her spirits and her dreams and her ideas. And she's life scale. When I say life scale, all my women are like 6 foot life scale. Not my own 5'2" life scale. And then this is a piece I did called Compton Nocturne. And she's maybe about 12 feet tall. And her skirt is basically copper that we pounded and then riveted together to make this big skirt. And I wanted to really talk about how the Underground Railroad often navigated in the dark through constellations and through the Northern Star. You heard follow the North Star, the Big Dipper. And so this is her during the day, but at night we have constellations that are coming. And I tried my best to do, the northern hemisphere of that. And somewhere in there is the Big Dipper, but it got a little contorted because it's not spherical. But at any rate, she's at the Columbus Museum. If you find yourself at Columbus, go check her out at the Columbus Museum of Art. And then this was one of the first really large bronze pieces I did. I worked with a foundry called Decker Studios in Los Angeles, and Sandy just retired, so I'm now working with another foundry, but this was an amazing space that was just around the corner from where my studio is now. And I had done this little piece as a wooden sculpture. It's called Traveling Light, again, a musical, a famous jazz classic, and by Billie Holiday as well. And the idea that, having been scorned by love so many times, you're not going to fall in love anymore because it just hurts too much to be burned again. and that she was not gonna, she was gonna travel light and not fall in love anymore. And so, I really thought about that, and I thought, oh yeah, you can do that, but then what are you missing out on? And it's about apathy, about not really willing to care about things because caring sometimes equates pain. And so this is a figure who is basically not going to feel, not going to be caring anymore. And he's a bell, so he has a little switch a little thread in his back that if you pull, it it bangs. So it's kind of like traditional, really beautiful Japanese bells, Chinese bells as well, that are bronze. And that's why I decided to make it in bronze. Up until this point, I'd always done things in wood, but because I wanted this actually to have a sound and really function as a bell. So it has this really low, how sometimes low tones, you just feel it in your gut, right? You feel it more than you even hear it. And so it's like a train in the distance sort of thing that you're like, did I imagine that? So anyway, so he's a bell, and the piece is about apathy. So I'm going to go into some of my public art. That piece actually is currently at the Sidney Bestoff Garden in New Orleans. And this is probably the most visible piece of mine. Is a Swing Low. It's a tribute to Harriet Tubman, a memorial for Harriet Tubman. And I was invited to do this in New York City, and I guess it was a little bittersweet because the funds to build this piece as a public percent program, and of course that percentage was buildings that were being built that was gentrifying Harlem. And so, on one hand we got this sculpture out of it, but on the other hand so many people were being displaced by, what was supposed to include lower income apartments, but they're always like underground corridor places or something like that. So I made this piece, and she's facing south, and there was a huge uproar that they're like, that girl doesn't even know what Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad was all about. It was about bringing people north. I'm like, well, what we're here to do is to celebrate Harriet Tubman and the more than 13 times she risked her life to go back down south to save others. And to me, it was we had basically cut the ribbon on this right after Obama had been elected, and it felt to me that anything was possible. Have since questioned that thought, but this idea that no matter who you are or what you are, you can always give something to someone else, and kind of use her as an example in terms of just being compassionate and doing something for other people. And so around the outskirts of this little stone wall are the words to "Let my people go." And then in her skirt are kind of pressing out the faces and objects of her passengers in the Underground Railroad. And then around the base are 10 images that kind of mark the different stations of her life. The ones we're looking at now in the far corner is when she escaped herself without telling her family or anything. And then her as Grandma Moses, as Moses and the Underground Railroad conductor, leading other people to freedom up north of the Freedom, and then interspersed by traditional quilt patterns, kind of in reference to the tales we hear of freedom quilts, which were quilts that were put out in safe houses to symbolize that it was safe to come to the house. And I also wanted to tell her story in images, not words, because she was illiterate. And I thought it was important that children can read her story even if they couldn't read, and people that spoke foreign languages could understand her story as well. And then I was invited by Lewis and Clark College to do a monument for York, who was the black slave of, was he the black slave of Lewis or Clark? Now I'm blanking out. But at any rate, he was invited to come on the expedition and basically saved their butts a number of times. They were starving, and he was able to, kill and bring food for them, and also was kind of a buffer between, when treading through indigenous lands, he was somehow worked as a mediary. But I wanted that you kind of come up to him, and he kind of has this kind of heroic pose, and he's holding this rifle that, everyone was like, oh yeah, they gave him a rifle. And you can see this little rock on the side down there. And on those rocks are all plaques, which are excerpts for the maybe dozen times that York was mentioned in the journals. And some of them were like, York, basically saved our butt today. He killed a buffalo, and we all, we ate for the rest of the month. And then there was another one was like, oh, York was sullen today, so I had to beat him. Or, York spent the day picking fleas off my blanket. Or, so you really saw how he was constantly his slave, even though he was a valuable, component in the success of the expedition. And so then on his back, I basically carved out a map. And so it's like he's been scarred from his lashings, because I think, I had to lash him 100 times a day or whatever. And then I think in the maps, there's one little, everyone in the expedition, had their names on things. I mean, mostly it was Clark this and Clark that and Lewis this and Lewis that. But there's one little line in one of these maps that says York's dry riverbed. And that was like, okay, we're going to just give him a little ravine. That's it. But I like this idea of, it talks about kind of the physical force upon his back, but it also really talks about Lewis Clark expedition and how it's really sort of, this sort of scar across the country, and how basically they just, is the beginning of the end of the frontier, and leading to the massacre of many indigenous peoples. And then this is a show I did at Madison Square Park in New York City. This piece is called Summer. There are 4 pieces, but I'm just going to show you 2 of them. But Summer, and then at night, she's got fireflies in her belly. Well, fake fireflies, but that was such a mind blower, being, a Westerner and going to back east and like, fireflies, oh my God, these are magic. And then this one was Fall, which is kind of talking about, so they're like the 4 stages of a woman's life. One is spring, which is adolescence, and she's up in a tree. And then there's summer, and she's pregnant, she's fertile. And then there's fall, and she's kind of falling into infertility. And so she's kind of gathering up these pomegranates that are falling off of her branched hair. So she's kind of trying to hang on to her fertility. And then the last one was Winter, which is this is kind of, it looks like a boulder, and then you get close and you can see it's a figure all balled up. And then this piece is entitled Embodied, and it was commissioned by LA County courthouse. It's not the courthouse. It's the housing. Well, it's the old LA County jail. So it's got some intense history, because the coroner's office was down below. I think that's where Bobby Kennedy was taken, and Marilyn Monroe, and it was where the Manson family was housed when they were finally captured. And so it has a really intense, dark history of all the things that have gone in Los Angeles. But, it was kind of like, it was Sheriff Baca who wanted to commission this, as his sort of his grand gesture, and exiting, of course, at that point was becoming apparent. I think it was always apparent to the people of color that lived in Los Angeles, but I think his abuses were becoming apparent to the county in general, in terms of racist policies that the county sheriff's department then and now continue to pursue. And he's like, I want the traditional thing with the blindfold and the scales and the sword. I'm like, well, one, the sword is supposed to be double-edged, but it's really just about it's basically about incarceration and execution. And the scales, this is a monetary scale, and that talks about the imbalance of justice, if anything, that if you got money, you have a very different justice than folks without money. And then the blindfold was really, folks aren't really understanding and seeing the plight as to why people have to sometimes behave in criminal manners just to survive, and what people are driven to because of lack of education and lack of funding and homes and all of these things. And so I decided, well, we're going to take a different stance on that. And there's a book for education in terms of the freedom and equity provided through education, if it were equitably available. A dove in terms of a more peaceful way of looking at dealing with crime. And then this long braid, which was an aspiration of bringing together the 3 components civilians, law enforcement, and judiciary system, that they should come together and support each other as opposed to fighting each other. And then I went around to a bunch of, all over Los Angeles, to parks and the county jailhouse and schools and all that, and asked everyone to give me 3 words for justice. And so I think we ended up with over 12 languages. We ended up with like over 200 words. And so her skirt is basically all like that. And I kind of wanted the voice, the fabric of this piece to be the voice of the Los Angeles civilians, people that lived in Los Angeles. And so that's what that's all about. And then that's what the braid looks like. This piece is called Cachet. This dreams in hair, big hairball. Blood, Sweat, Tears. This was a piece I did while I was mourning the death of my father. He was 81 years when he passed, and so she's got 81 cast bronze tears on her. And this piece is Shorn, also a mourning piece, but this was mourning my children leaving home and kind of becoming adults, and kind of like, it was sort of empty nesting. And on one hand, there's this practice of mourning where you cut off all of your hair and you're kind of like shedding all of that to start anew. And so it's also kind of cutting off all of that mom hair and kind of trying to discover who I am outside of being a mother. And so she's cut her hair off with a piece of glass, a shirt of glass. And then this is 50 proof, and this was when I was invited by Pilchuck Glass School up in Seattle, or just north of Seattle in Washington. And again, this was around the time when Obama was elected, and so this piece is called 50 proof. But I was not sure what I wanted to do at the Pilchuck. I'm not really that interested in art glass, but I was interested in the history of glass and alchemy. And this idea that something so fragile could be also so impenetrable, that it can hold acid, but it could also just as easily be shattered. And so I was wondering, I think we were all celebrating and kind of thinking, this is great that we have a biracial man elected president, or a man that identifies as black and being president. But at the same time, all of this stuff started permeating up through the underground. And through social media, we were starting to see images of cartoons of watermelons on the White House lawn, and Barack and Michelle portrayed as monkeys. And, I think that was the tip of the iceberg of what we are experiencing here and now in the United States, that racism is alive and strong. And I was kind of like, well, what does it take to overcome bigotry? And I thought, well, maybe we need to distill it down to its essence. And so these are all sort of distilleries or distillation systems that, so basically for this one, this is 50 proof for the tragic mulatta. And so you pump this pump and it draws this black water up, and it goes into the heart and fills the heart halfway with black, and then it goes up into the head and it fills this black ink up to her eyes, and then she cries the tears back into the basin. And she has a choice. She's got black tar soap or ivory soap to choose from, that you have to kind of identify as one thing or the other. This piece is called En Point, again kind of talking about sort of my struggles with what I consider my crazy savage self, and always trying to keep it together and be civilized and not nutty or insane. And a play, En Point, of course, is dancing on toes, which is also really unnatural. You're like hooves, right, when you're dancing on point. And then, these points of the antlers are also kind of playing off of En Point, that she's balancing on the points of her antlers. And then this piece was called Wait. Did this after volunteering at a high school that my daughter was going to school at. And it's an arts high school, and it was so great because you didn't have to have a portfolio to get in, which meant that, that most of the kids in Los Angeles County, rarely had art classes, because LA County doesn't necessarily think art is such an essential thing. And so they were coming into the school with no art experience per se, and they would have sometimes up to 4 classes a day of art, and just to see them blossom under that sort of support was just incredible. And these are kids largely Latinx and Black, and from Chinatown. So it's in Chinatown, between Chinatown and downtown. And then, we got them, to apply to colleges. They would have been the first of their generation to go to college, and they got into colleges, and they've even got scholarships. But that gap between, your scholarship and actually being able to go to school and being able to live somewhere not other than in your car, and it was just undoable. And a lot of these kids needed to, basically work after school to help their families in their own businesses, or help their families, clean after work and stuff like that. And so it was really tragic to see that we were able to get them to this one point, and then, they were then kind of thrown back to kind of having to pursue the opportunities that were available to their parents, who also were denied the opportunity to be educated. And so she's on this swing, and it's like, oh, it's cute, this little girl on a swing, but then you realize she's stripped bare, and then you realize that the swing is attached to a cotton scale, which were used in the fields to weigh how much the cotton was. And then her cornucopia is a coal scuttle filled with tools of domestic labor. So a sickle and chains and frying pans for cooking and domestic work and all of that. And if you were to actually pick one of those objects up, she would come crashing down. So she's physically balancing on this scale in the gallery, and the wind will turn her. And so just really kind of talking about how tenuous, even now, these generations are trying to contend with, trying to kind of go beyond the limitations placed, for their parents and generations before them because of the color of their skin. This is Deluge. I had visited New Orleans maybe about 5 years after Katrina, and to see that, much of it was still devastated, that nothing had been done, and all these false promises, and to really just started thinking about floodwaters and people of color living in floodplains, that, this was land that was provided to them, soggy bottoms, hollows, whatever you want to call them, because it was basically uninhabitable. There's mosquitoes, and it's just not a healthy sort of space. But it was the only land that they could afford, the only homes they could afford. And you think now that so many people from New Orleans that got flooded out in Katrina are still living in Texas or other places that they were never able to return. So this one is kind of looking at the power of the water spirit and how destructive it can be. And then this one is Breach. Katrina led me to look at the Great Mississippi Flood in 1927. And you could put pictures side by side of people trying to carry their belongings through floodwaters on their heads because they don't want their stuff to get wet, and people stranded up on the levees, or in New Orleans, they're stranded up on the freeway overpasses, the only thing that was above the water level. And just to think how 80 years had spanned in the policies, the flood, we don't, it's going to take a lot to kind of alleviate the floods in terms of climate change, but we can definitely change the policies in terms of how to take care of people that are in the path of natural disasters, and how to help them survive them. So this is sort of a figure that's basically got everything balanced upon her head, all her belongings, and she's poling down the middle of the gallery. I would say that piece is, I know it's 13 feet tall because my studio is 14 feet tall, and it was just the only thing I could do to get it kind of in that last bit. Topsy and the Golden Fleece. I became really interested in the Topsy figure. I've kind of circled back to her a number of times, Topsy being a character in Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. And somehow, even though she's a minimal character in the book, and Beecher Stowe, it was an abolitionist, definitely had its problems, but the idea being that, if we treated slaves properly, they wouldn't have these problems, sort of things. She needed to take it a few steps further, but this idea that Topsy was this wild, unmanageable, ignorant child because she'd been stripped of her mother and sold away and never cared for, never treated like a real child. But I always saw Topsy as being sort of like a Puck character, that she was always questioning what was going on, and that she was wild and that she embraced her wildness. That when someone accused her of stealing earrings, she hadn't stolen them, but she was like, yeah, I guess if I'm badass, I must have stole those earrings. And so I just love this way that she kind of just like stepped up to the plate and said, okay, yeah, I'm badass, you got to watch out. And so in this case, I think in one part of the story that, Topsy's sort of mirror, where she is like dark and, has her hair and like piglet type tail sort of thing. Eva is blonde and fair skinned, and her blonde hair is blinding that you can't even look at her without, being overwhelmed by her goodness. And she's on her deathbed. She's handing out strands of her golden hair, which people say is basically, this gift of the master of Christianity to the slaves, and that's going to be what's going to save them. And Topsy sees through that. She says, well, if your power is in your blonde hair, I'm just taking it all. And so here she is with the golden fleece, which is Topsy's, little Eva's scalp. This piece is called High Cotton. Again, kind of following this Topsy thing. And I think, this image became really potent to me after hearing the tape by Diamond, Philando Castile's girlfriend, who was in the car when he was murdered. And you can hear her daughter in the background saying, I don't want you to get shooted too, Mommy, don't get shooted. And you think, oh my God, there was a child in the back seat when that happened. And that's not the only time that's happened. I mean, at any rate, it gives me chills. But I was trying to think, well, how does this girl go forward in life? How does she not see the world as evil and hopeless as it is? And I wanted to give her hope and give her tools to push past that trauma. And so this is an army of little girls who have taken the tools of their trade. So we've got the 5 slave tools. They say rice, cotton, tobacco, sugar, and indigo. And they're basically taking their tools to bring down the master's house, to kind of turn Audre Lorde's quote upside down. But and they've tied cotton balls to their hair. And there's a painting where they're actually coming through the field. It's kind of like Children of the Corn, only Children of the Cotton Fields. And they're kind of coming through, and you see the cotton, and it's like, oh, this is the landscape with cotton. And then you realize there are these dark figures pushing forward, ready to kick your ass. So. And then this is Grode. There was another line in Uncle Tom's Cabin where, I don't know, Auntie somebody was trying to get her to, recognize Christianity and acknowledge it. And she said, so where did you come from, Topsy? And she said, me, I didn't come from nowhere. I was just Grode. And I just love that she had more kinship with the cotton growing or the wild stuff growing out there, as opposed to what these white masters and owners were trying to form her into. And so here she is on a throne. And then I think after all of those pieces, which were really angry, and I always try to have my work point towards something healing and some sort of resolution. And I think that's been a really tough bill, and since 2016, it's been increasingly hard to be optimistic. And I think I needed at some point to kind of step back, and I was looking for something comforting. And so I started thinking about the kitchen and cooking and times with my grandmother and my cousins, and all the things that happen in the kitchen would be cooking in our household. Printmaking was also happening in the kitchen with acid baths by the sink, but also, hairdressing, because you'd use the stove to heat up your hot comb and all of that stuff. So it really was a space where women could gather and could have conversations and could be supportive and could literally and figuratively feed the spirit and soul. And so this is the kitchen Amazon, and it's a story kind of playing off of, again, looking at you look at Greek mythology and stories out of the Iliad and Odyssey, and how women are always being bludgeoned for just existing. And of course, the Queen of the Amazon, they wanted her girdle. She said, sure, take it. But then someone what'd you say? And they ended up killing them all. So this is her with her girdle of frying pans and holding a frying pan aloft, kind of talk about sort of this strength and power behind feeding and being nurturing as opposed to conquering and killing. And then I started making, during the pandemic, I started making really tiny pieces because I wasn't going to the studio. And I had some hot combs, and so I started making hot comb haints, because this idea that, when you hot comb your hair, you heat up the comb and you pull it through your hair, and it takes all the kink out, and then it's long and straight and lovely. But then also, where does all that wildness go? Where does all that crazy savageness go? And so I made these little handle figures, and they're basically holding on to it for you until you're ready to embrace your wild self. And then this piece was part of that show as well, it's called Set to Simmer. And again, in odalisque, they're often holding these mirrors, these vanities, and this figure is holding this black skillet as maybe a vanity, but also, this sort of thing, well, you can look, but don't touch. So she's kind of like, instead of kind of being coy and covering herself, she's just like, this is me, this is what I look at. We put a chair out there, you're supposed to pull up this chair and sit down and look at her. Like, don't be looking at me out of the side of your eye. Don't be kind of like, what? Sit down and look at me in my face. And so you're sitting down and you're looking at her, and if you behave yourself, she's not gonna knock you upside the head. But then this is a collaboration with Dion Brand, a really amazing poet living up in Canada. And if you open the drawer, there's all these objects. I know we've all had drawers like this in our own homes or our grandmother's homes or whatnot, which is like the catch-all drawer, where it's like bits of string and pencils that are like an inch long, and all these things, keys to nowhere. And so I said, I'm doing this piece, would you write something? And so she wrote all these funny little, beautiful little snippets. Some of them are like grocery lists, and some of them are, they're just really beautiful. So they're printed on little notepads, or printed on key labels and all of that. And so again, this idea is like, yeah, you see me, you see my body, you think you know me, open this drawer and read these things and really know who I am. And it's just was a wonderful kind of obscure journey to kind of the complexities as to who we all are. Congoline is a hair straightening process, so this is my badge for that show, called Congoline Resistance, that she's resisting straightening her hair. She's embracing herself. And Stubborn and Kinky was actually written on some cans of these pomades, like, it'll tame the most stubborn and kinky hair. And I'm like, no, just embrace that kinkiness. In the last few slides, I'm sorry, these go on forever. It's called Torch Song. And I kind of wanted to talk about women like Nina Simone and Bessie Smith and Ma Rainey, and all these powerful blues singers, Abby Lincoln, and how their music is their weapon, especially in songs songs of protest. And so these kind of piano keys have become like bandoleros that are kind of draped over her shoulder. And then this is the piece I did for the Benton College, which is just opened up at Pomona, called Imbue. Again, very much like the Yemaku Maman piece, that she's kind of like cooling, and this idea by pouring water into the ground. The land that this building and much of Pomona College is built on used to be a river coming down from the Gabrielanos. And this was a river that was really important to the Gabrielanos, indigenous people. And so I kind of wanted to recognize that in this piece, but also this idea of kind of education as being a cooling of the mind and a filling up. So that's what this piece is about. And then this is the piece that I have that's at the Armory. It's called Hygeia, who's in Greek mythology, one of the three muses for health, and Hygeia being sanitation and washing and cleaning. And of course, I had this idea before that I wanted to kind of talk about, this sort of invisible population of folks that came in and cleaned offices, or, took care of things at night, and sort of kind of helped keep our lives together by keeping things organized, by taming the chaos, I guess, wrangling chaos. And then when COVID hit, all of a sudden there was this recognition of, not only the doctors and nurses, but the people that go into those hospitals and risk their lives mopping the floors and things like that. And, how, sanitation really became something that we all really understand the importance of. So she is holding a double-edged broom, kind of like those, I don't know what they're called, where they're double-edged axe things for fighting and stuff like that. And then there's a sound component in the piece where it's water dripping, so it feels like all these buckets are filling up with water and sweeping. And in some Yoruba cultures, sweeping is a means of drawing the spirits up, that they hear that and they'll come to you and surface to you. So it is also a calling of the spirit world. And she's actually the Armory was actually an armory, and there's a small vault space which has like concrete walls this thick where they used to store all the munitions. And I think ever since I saw an installation that my mother had done there, I'd wanted to do something in that space. So it was really wonderful to kind of go in there and talk about these powerful people that really have such an impact on our lives and are largely ignored, but largely invisible. And it was also kind of a play on the Invisible Man with all the light bulbs hanging down Ralph Ellison's book. And the very last piece is a piece called Beckoning that's in a show that I curated at LA Louvre called Seen Unseen, and it was talking about artists as mediums and kind of being this sort of conduit between the spirit world and the real world. And I think, I have two pieces in the show. One piece is a little guy at the front. He's like Elegua, who is the guardian of the crossroads, and he's kind of like serving as the bouncer for this show, that good spirits can come in, but any menacing spirits are going to have to wait outside the door. And so he's kind of filtering that coming in. And also Elegua is who you would call to open the doors of the spirit world and call other spirits to connect with you. So he's kind of like managing the door. And then in the back there's this room that is all this kind of dark Prussian indigo blue. And this figure, you can't really tell because it got a little blown out, but she's holding a bundle of bottles and light bulbs. And she is, I call it Beckoning. She's basically the one that guides us out of chaos and out of, what is it called when you're kind of caught in between? Well, leads you to the underworld. And I think it was really important to me because, it's so many of us have lost people during the time of COVID and how we have not been able to have any closure. And I feel that there are so many spirits out there that are feeling lost and not complete, that transition hasn't been able to be completed because we haven't been able to gather and mourn properly. And so I had this piece, and it's got all these mirrors and kind of beckoning these spirits to come, and she can help them find their way home. And that's it. So thank you. I don't know. I kind of went on forever. I don't know if we have time we're kind of past our thing, but it's up to you. Do we have time for questions? Or?
Let's do a few questions, because I've got a question.
Okay. We'll start with you.
You talk a lot, there's many places, many questions, but one question I have is, I was really curious about the role of collaboration in your work, particularly with bronze casting, but also, you talk about your studio assistants. You use we often, talk here and there in the talk, and you're just sort of curious how you think about collaboration, how it shaped your work, and then in particular, because because of bronze and bronze casting, you really have to have a lot of equipment and an expert. And just where that stands and what that thread does.
Yeah, and that's, I think I'm probably most comfortable working in my space by myself, just because, and I love having assistants, but sometimes it's kind of like, you're working to find things for the assistants to do, but when it really clicks is when we're covering these figures with tin and we're all in there working, and there's kind of trying not to hit each other on the hands with hammers, but we get this rhythm and we kind of put on some music that jives with it, and so then that becomes a real richness. And I think I mentioned earlier when we were working with Dane, and this sort of thing where we were all just spinning and having this great conversation. We had some lovely snacks for the occasion that Marie was providing, and so there's something really rich and beautiful about that, and such a nice contrast to the way I normally work. And then both with Pilchuck and with working with the foundry at Pilchuck, they have professional gaffers they invite artists to come work with professionals, and you tell them what you're thinking, and they'll tell you if it's possible or not. The other thing is that I work with a lot of print studios, and that's really lovely because I come to them with a block and they're like, oh, we can do this, we can do that. And I said, well, can we do this? And they're like, we have never done that, but let's try it. It's just really lovely when we're kind of inventing things, and it becomes really fun. And, and I don't know, I'm worried because mostly all of the really tedious stuff goes to folks that are helping you, but you hope that somehow that helps connect something for them as well as getting paid. But, I don't know, my nephew's in the audience. He's been my assistant on occasion as well. So, but it's nice. Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
Alison, I'm curious as to two questions actually. When you're casting, do you cast more than one, or is it just one? And secondly, when you're doing like the braids way out, or you did the horns of the figure hanging, is that one piece, or is that cast separately and put together?
Right. Well, the horns, for example, I basically had some deer antlers that we made molds of, and so I just casted a bunch of them, and then we welded them because it's like a 12-point antler or something outrageous. And they were antler sheds. I always have to say no animals were harmed in the making of this art. And those are cast. Those are two pieces so that they can come out of her head. Originally, it was one piece, and it was impossible to store. So now that we cut them and threaded them so they can be two pieces. And the other things, I used to make them out of wood, but then I decided I needed, one because they just became really fragile and stuff like that. Started casting them. So I have molds of components. So I have molds of branches and molds of brambles and molds of frying pans and molds of, those things. But, generally the public art, they're all just one-offs. And which is, it's an incredible amount of waste in terms of the materials that go into making it. So I'm working with someone now that we're trying to switch that up a little bit. And one of the ways of doing that is not making silicone molds, but scanning and digitizing them and then printing them in foam and clay, and foam and wax, and then they just burn out, so you don't have massive quantities of foam that's being chucked in. Then he's also doing something where he's putting supports in sand that can then be recycled to use over and over again. So, but that's something that is really kind of disturbing, the lack of, and just the amount of waste of materials that go into it, and especially if you're just doing one piece. So we'll see. I'm trying to kind of like up my game on that. But
Thank you.
No, my pleasure. Anyone else?
One more question?
Everyone's weary.
I have one.
Okay.
I was going to ask you, what was it like growing up in a family with a mother who was an artist?
Well, my mother just left the room, so I could say anything. It was pretty amazing, right, Tracy? It was just what was happening all the time. It was, what we did. She kept us busy by giving us materials to make stuff, and, it was really, I think, really formative for us to have, I think she was showing when we were pretty young still. She was working as well, working in theater and teaching a little bit, but to just see how this woman could raise a family. She was single at that time and raised a family. And we always had the support of my father. So my father, we worked with him in the afternoons. But to just, see how you could really do those two things. Because I think when I had my first child, I went to someone and I said, I don't know if I'm doing the right thing. I'm spending so much time making enough money to pay for a babysitter to watch my child that it doesn't, it's economically kind of backwards, and I would much rather just hang out and take my own kid to the park sort of thing. And how they said, no, well, the problem with that is that then that's who you are, is you're solely their keeper sort of thing. And that, it's really important that you do what's important to you and have your own sense of self. And even with all that, even though I was making all that art, I still had to make all this crisis, empty nest art. I still was kind of like falling apart. But it was just really rich, and we'd go to openings and drink the dregs of all the wine left over. And it was great.
Well, thank you very
Cool.
much.
Thank you.